Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Aliyah Chavez, a multimedia reporter with Indian Country Today, based in Phoenix, Arizona. Aliyah is a member of Kewa Pueblo, one of the 21 Indigenous nations in New Mexico. She's a journalism and communications graduate from Stanford University. Aliyah, thanks for being on the show.
Hi, Dennis. Great to be here.
We always appreciate having you as a guest on the news to provide your insight, and it's certainly been a busy and crazy time in the U.S. Let's start by going back a few weeks and the storming of the U.S. Capitol building. 5 people died. Many were not surprised this is where things ended up going. When we had your colleague Mark Trahant on right before the election, he spoke about how both sides of the political divide were quite literally willing to kill for their side. What do you make of what happened that day?
Definitely. As you mentioned, I think January 6th is a day that a lot of Americans won't forget for a very long time. Really, I think a lot of us journalists were watching this rally by former President Trump with his supporters in hopes of what they like to call, quote, stop the steal. And then it really turned into something that no one saw coming. And as you mentioned, the aftermath of those violent riots and, the mob that broke and destroyed federal property, we saw Indigenous lawmakers on both sides of the aisle saying that they condemned the violence, but also some saying that they still supported President Trump in the aftermath, and others saying and supporting his impeachment, which, the trial for that will begin very soon. And I'm sure all of us will be watching to see what happens to former President Trump in terms of if he is in fact held accountable for his actions.
Arrests are still continuing to be made, but, Black and Indigenous and other people of color were quick to point out the treatment that these Trump supporters and white nationalists received when they stormed the Capitol, basically being let in. Police were taking pictures with some of them. What were you hearing from people over the way that these people were treated as they stormed the Capitol building?
Definitely. A colleague of mine, Dalton Walker, who's also a reporter at Indian Country Today, actually covered this. And he spoke to a lot of Native people saying there was very much a double standard here in terms of how the people in Washington, D.C. who supported the president were treated versus how Native people are treated. We saw a lot of Native people when they were standing in solidarity with the land and with, water protectors who were very much violently condemned for their actions. And I think a lot of those people in Washington, D.C. are still waiting to, face justice and to figure out how did this happen. They walked into the Capitol and then they walked home, or they went home safely at night. And I think it's really hard to not ignore the double standard that was there, as you mentioned.
Given that double standard, how do you think this would have played out if it was Black Lives Matter or Indigenous people trying to protest on the Capitol?
It's really hard to say. I think a lot of what I've heard on social media is that Black and brown people would not have been treated the same. There would probably definitely have been arrests made. And there were other ways that protesters have been treated by police previously. When the Black Lives Matter marches were taking place over the summer, we saw police officers dressed in full riot gear and them using a lot of harmful force on protesters, using tear gas and rubber bullets and things like that. And so it's just really hard to understand how this played out and also how it's continuing to play out.
There was, of course, because of that, a lot of concern for the inauguration, which basically saw the Capitol locked down. But, Trump may be gone, but as you say, there's still people that support those ideas that are in government. Have things cooled down, or can we expect threats of this type of violence in the future?
That's a really good question. A lot of experts are saying that, well, former President Trump might be out of office. The rhetoric that he created is here to stay. And so currently I haven't heard of any reports of, any planned riots or protests or anything of that sort. But I think it's also important to note that on social media, companies are taking actions against folks who are inciting violence on those platforms. And so it might be really hard to tell if this will happen again, given that a lot of people were actually organizing protests like this on social media. So the short answer to that is that it's hard to say.
You covered Inauguration Day. What was the mood from those you spoke with?
Definitely. I think especially for the Native Democrats, the mood was very light. I heard so many people say that they were relieved, that it was the first time they could take a breath of fresh air in 4 years. People especially loved the fact that there was a lot of women of color and people of color on the stages of the inauguration. I'm sure a lot of people have seen the poet, Amanda Gorman, and people in Indian country really just rallied behind her. They really loved seeing her on that stage. And on the flip side, there was actually a number of people who said that they expected more. In the inauguration, Jennifer Lopez sang, "This land is your land," and a lot of people were saying that is not at all indicative of Indigenous people, and they felt that it was anti-Indigenous, and so they expressed that on social media as well. So I would say, in short, that there was a lot of relief for many people, but also some questions of how these programming was created, and hoping for there to be better in the future.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the Jennifer Lopez thing, but like you say, there was some criticism that there wasn't much acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples in the ceremony. Did you hear any of that?
Yeah, a lot of people mentioned that as well. I think with the nomination of Representative Deb Holland as Interior Secretary, a lot of people are really expecting that the Biden administration will stand up and show the inclusivity that they've really been talking about on the campaign trail. And that was one big point that people were making. A lot of people felt that that was a miss in terms of there not being a land acknowledgement, or really not having any Native representation in the programming. So definitely, I think some room for improvement in the future there.
You know, there was some high-profile support for Trump going into the election from tribal leaders. Are there going to be people who miss Trump's leadership, I guess is what you call it?
Yeah, and I think that that's really important. It's estimated that 60% of Native people in the U.S. vote Democrat, and the other 30 to 40% vote independent or Republican. And so it's really important to note that not every Native person in the country is Democrat. There are a handful of Republicans and independents as well. And as you mentioned, a lot of those very vocal Native supporters of Trump have already spoken and had criticism for the Biden administration and his executive actions. And a lot of them also on Inauguration Day and the days leading up to that were reminding people that Trump had accomplished creating a task force for the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and highlighted other accomplishments that they felt shouldn't be ignored. So I think that that's a great point. We shouldn't forget about, all of the Native Republicans who support Trump.
Leah, we're going to talk about some of those executive orders and other issues. Just got to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Aliyah Chavez. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Aliyah Chavez, a reporter-producer with Indian Country Today. And Aliyah, President Biden got down to work on some controversial issues that made many Indigenous people happy. Let's start with the revoking of the permit of the Keystone XL pipeline. How is that decision sitting?
I think tribal leaders in the U.S. have been very happy about that decision. I had read a report saying that they were very happy that the federal government has listened to tribes and upheld their federal trust responsibility. So I think, in short, a lot of people are very happy about that decision.
What do you think that signals? Could that be a change that comes for other pipeline projects like Line 3 and ones operating now like Dakota Access Pipeline that continues to remain before the courts?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, a couple of weeks ago, leaders in South Dakota wrote a letter to President Biden urging him to halt the Dakota Access Pipeline, as you just mentioned. They specifically called on the Army Corps of Engineers to stop the flow of oil through that pipeline. And it seems to have gained a lot of traction. I know there was a number of media reports about that, and it seems like tribes are really hoping to use the momentum from the Keystone XL pipeline into stopping other pipelines that you just mentioned as well.
Another early move by Biden was the halting of the construction of the border wall. What are the implications of that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's something that I think we can expect to see more of, specifically under Representative Deb Holland's tenure as Interior Secretary, if she is confirmed by the Senate. I think that a lot of people have expressed support for the stopping of the construction of the border wall. So far, more than 400 miles has been constructed. And actually, a part of that was on tribal lands. There was a tribal leader who testified before Congress earlier last year, actually saying that his sacred sites were demolished by dynamite in order to build that wall, and that there was very little tribal consultation in that process. So I think, definitely halting the construction of that has made a lot of tribal leaders happy, specifically because their lands and their sacred sites can be protected in the future.
Now, you mentioned Deb Holland. Let's talk about her nomination to head up the Department of the Interior. She would be, if approved, the first Native American to hold a cabinet position. How important is that?
It's a huge deal. I've been doing more research about this, and on the White House's website, I actually learned that if she is confirmed by the Senate, she would be sixth in line in succession of the presidency. And so the Interior Secretary is incredibly high up in terms of the order of the president's cabinet. And so we'll be able to see, as I mentioned, if she is confirmed, we'll be able to see the priorities that she takes. A lot of the executive actions that President Biden has signed already have to do with federal lands and waters, and that falls directly in line with the Interior Department. So I can imagine that she'll have her work set out for her starting on day one. Actually, I would even be poised to say hours after she's confirmed. I imagine she'll get to work very quickly.
What impact do you think an Indigenous person can have in that role, and is it going to be a real tricky one for her, trying to work both sides of things here?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right now, we're currently waiting for the Senate to announce when her confirmation hearing will happen. And I think at that hearing, she's going to get a lot of questions that you just mentioned. The question of how do you balance your personal core values with also doing what's right for the American people? And so I imagine she'll have to answer that question a lot during her Senate confirmation hearing. And the short answer to that is I personally don't know, but I imagine that she's being briefed by some of the best in terms of how to do that. And also, I've met with her a couple of times, and she's incredibly down to earth. And so I can imagine, that she's praying on it and asking for guidance from her personal beliefs and her personal religious views. And, I can only hope that she does the best that she can during that hearing.
Well, we hope to get her on one of our shows up here. A couple of us have put in requests, and we're told you're going to be waiting a few months. So
that's what I hear too.
As we've reported, there were a record number, not just Deb Holland, but a record number of Indigenous people elected during this last U.S. election. What does that say to you, and what does that say to the people of Indian country?
Yeah, I think most notably, the Indigenous representation in Congress is sort of the big story there. Before the 2020 election, there were 4 Native members of Congress, and now there are 6. And it's also important to note the political parties of those Indigenous members. There are currently 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, and more times than not, those members vote in terms of their party. We see a lot of the Native Republicans supporting Trump, still voicing their support for him. And we also see the Native Democrats saying he should be impeached, he should be convicted, and really being vocal about the ways in which they feel the Trump administration failed. And so it's really interesting to see the balance of those Indigenous members of Congress, and also moving forward to sort of see how they vote or what kinds of bills and legislation that they introduce. On the other hand, though, not in Congress, in various state governments, as you mentioned, there are a lot of Indigenous candidates who are already getting to work that were elected. A couple of those that I love to always mention being this 26-year-old state legislator in Kansas. Her name is Christina Haswood, and she's actually the youngest sitting legislator in the state, which is huge. She says that she was inspired to run by people like Representative Holland and Representative Sharice Davids, and so we're really seeing their leadership and their mentorship come to life in other candidates. And another one of those candidates also in Kansas being Kansas Representative Stephanie Byers. She's actually the first transgender person in Kansas's history to be elected to their state legislature. So just all up and down the ballot, really, really cool Indigenous lawmakers taking office and taking control of what types of policies and change that they're going to elicit.
Record numbers there, but you mentioned still a deeply divided country. What do you think some of the hopes are for Indian country over the next 4 years here?
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of people are really hoping that President Biden stays true to the tribal nations plan that he introduced to tribes on the campaign trail. A lot of the plan talks about upholding tribal sovereignty and respecting the nation-to-nation relationship that the federal government has with tribal nations. And so we'll really see that come to life. He's promised Native leaders a seat at the table. He promised Native people to serve in very high-level positions, which, of course, we're seeing with the nomination of Deb Holland. But also, he's vowed to help tribes with a number of very important issues, including the coronavirus pandemic. He's vowed to help tribes and support many issues in terms of education or social justice. One of the things in his plan that really stood out to me was the promise to include more funding to tribal colleges and universities, which I think is just really, really neat. And hopefully, as I mentioned, that President Biden stays true to those promises, and we'll just have to see how it plays out.
Aliyah, you mentioned the pandemic there, and we haven't even touched on it yet, so I'm hoping we just got to step aside for one more quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Indian Country Today's Aliyah Chavez. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Aliyah Chavez, a reporter and producer with Indian Country Today. And Aliyah, we've been talking about politics, but in the background of this all, of course, is the global pandemic. How are things playing out in Indian country with the pandemic right now?
Yeah, doesn't the news cycle have to be so crazy that the pandemic is the thing that, we kind of all remember, oh my gosh, this is happening right now. Mm-hmm. I think that's a very good question, specifically in terms of how the pandemic has played out in Indian country. One of the biggest examples of that is the Navajo Nation. For a very long time, a lot of us knew that that nation was seeing some of the highest rates of COVID-19 in the United States. And now, unfortunately, we're seeing the death toll of that. The Navajo Nation is actually very close to hitting the death toll of 1,000 deaths, which is extremely unfortunate. These are mothers, fathers, language speakers, community members, and it's just extremely sad to see that. And even more sad than that, the Navajo Nation is one of many, many tribes in the country who are also dealing with this. And so I think right now a lot of Native people are seeing the impacts of that. And specifically, I hear a lot of people talking about the coronavirus affecting every family across the country here. I know off the top of my head many families who have lost family members to the pandemic, and it's just, one of those things that is very, very sad to see and to report on as well.
Vaccinations have started here in Canada. It's a slow-moving process, but First Nations are near the top of the list. How are vaccinations playing out in tribes?
Yeah, I think we're also sort of slowly seeing that come to life as well. The last that I heard, tribes were given allocations through either the Indian Health Service or through the states that they fall under. I've seen a lot of people reporting on elders and first language speakers being some of the first people to get vaccinated, which I think is just so important and really great to see. I know some of my own family members who are first language speakers and elders have been vaccinated, and it's just such a sigh of relief to know that, they'll be okay, hopefully, and that we're sort of nearing the end of this. I mean, we can only hope that that's the case.
We've seen some movement already by President Biden, but is there some hope that a new president can somehow help turn things around in the U.S. with this virus?
Yeah, I think all of our eyes are sort of watching that as well. President Biden already has issued a mask mandate on all federal property, which hadn't happened before. And I know he tweets a lot about wear a mask and, wash your hands and stay home as much as you can. And even just seeing the rhetoric like that from the leader of the United States has been a huge change. We very rarely saw former President Trump wearing a mask, and a lot of the people that he was around also not wearing masks. And so I sort of think it's small changes like that that hopefully get a lot of people being more safe and in turn sort of slowing the spread and stopping deaths and even more infections.
Well, Aliyah, I was going to ask you what you're going to be keeping your eye on in the coming weeks, but we're out of time for this week, although we know you'll be covering the confirmation hearing for Deb Holland, so we'll be watching for that and all your other coverage with Indian Country today. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
That is all the time we have for this week. You can catch up on any episode you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. And you can find those podcasts at aptnnews.ca/face-to-face podcast. Every show is also available as a podcast. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for tuning in to Face to Face. Have a great night. We'll see you back here next week.